In 2021, Greece woke up to a crime that would soon become one of the most shocking murder stories in modern history. It all began on the morning of May 11th in a quiet suburb of Athens, when police received a desperate call from a man who said armed robbers had broken into his home. The voice on the line was trembling, heavy with panic, claiming his wife had been killed, his baby was in danger, and he himself had barely survived. When police rushed to the scene, what they found was nothing short of terrifying. A young woman named Caroline Crouch was lying lifeless in her bedroom, her baby girl crying beside her. Her husband, Babis Anagnostopoulos, a helicopter pilot, was found tied up, duct tape covering his mouth and eyes. The house looked as if it had been torn apart. Drawers were pulled out, jewelry boxes emptied, furniture pushed over, and in the stairwell even the family's pet dog had been killed and left hanging. To anyone who saw it, the truth seemed obvious. A violent home invasion had gone horribly wrong. But, as investigators would soon discover, nothing about this crime was what it seemed. To understand how shocking this story was, you need to know who Caroline really was. She was just 20 years old when she died, a bright and free-spirited young woman who had spent most of her childhood on the island of Alonissos. Her father, David Crouch, was a British-born engineer who had moved to Greece, while her mother, Susan, was of Filipino descent. Caroline grew up with the sea around her, spending her childhood swimming, diving, and enjoying the calm of island life. People who knew her described her as intelligent, adventurous, and full of life. But her life changed dramatically when she was just 15 years old, and she caught the attention of a man almost twice her age, a helicopter pilot named Babis Anagnostopoulos. Babis was 27 when he first met Caroline. To a teenager, he must have seemed almost larger than life, an older man with money, success, and a career that sounded glamorous. He even flew helicopters over her school to impress her. To her friends, it seemed exciting, even romantic. But what looked like a fairy tale romance was built on something much darker. Within 3 years, Babis and Caroline had eloped, marrying secretly in Portugal in 2019. By then, Caroline was still just 18, barely out of school, starting her adult life with a man nearly a decade older who already had complete control over her. To outsiders, their relationship seemed picture-perfect. Photos of them together painted the image of a happy couple, but those pictures hid what was happening behind closed doors. By 2021, the couple were living in Athens with their baby girl, building what they claimed was their dream life. Caroline's parents gave her €50,000 to help buy land for a future house. They kept some of the money hidden at home, nearly €10,000 in cash, tucked away inside a Monopoly box, a habit not unusual in Greece, where many people still avoided banks. To friends and neighbors, it seemed like Caroline and Babis were settling into a comfortable future together. They had money, they had a home, and most importantly, they had a beautiful child. But the reality inside their marriage was not so simple. On the night of May 10th, just hours before Caroline's death, something went very wrong inside the couple's home. According to Babis's first version of events, everything began when 3 masked men broke in. He claimed they tied him up, blindfolded him with duct tape, and threatened him at gunpoint. They demanded money, and under pressure, he told them about the Monopoly box with the cash. He said the men opened it, grabbed the money, and continued searching for more valuables. They even killed the family's dog, leaving it hanging on the stairs as a warning. Caroline, terrified and holding her 11-month-old baby, tried to fight back. According to Babis, the men attacked her and strangled her in front of their child. By the time the ordeal was over, the house was a disaster. Jewelry was missing, drawers emptied, belongings scattered everywhere. When police first arrived, the story seemed believable. The scene looked like a violent robbery. A security camera had been ripped from the wall, and its memory card removed. Babis himself appeared shaken, tied with ropes and duct tape, struggling to speak. He told police that he had only managed to call them by using his nose to dial his phone. The crime shocked Greece. Newspapers ran headlines about a young mother killed by heartless intruders, her baby left crying at her side. Politicians promised justice. Citizens were terrified, thinking dangerous criminals were still at large. And through it all, Babies appeared to be the grieving husband, speaking to the media with tears in his eyes, holding his daughter at his wife's funeral, praising Caroline as the love of his life. But as days turned into weeks, detectives began to see cracks in the story. Something about the crime scene did not add up. The basement window Babies claimed the intruders used was far too small for 3 grown men to squeeze through. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual that night. No shouts, no struggle, no break-in noises, only the faint cries of the couple's puppy. And then there was the evidence from Caroline's own smartwatch. Police discovered that her biometric data revealed a very different timeline from the one her husband gave. According to the watch, her heart rate spiked dramatically at 4:05 a.m., showing signs of extreme stress, and then stopped entirely at 4:11 a.m. Yet Babies told investigators the intruders killed her much later. If he was telling the truth, how could her watch have stopped nearly an hour earlier? As investigators dug deeper, more inconsistencies appeared. Data from Babis's own phone showed movement around the house during the time he claimed he was tied up and unconscious. His story about dialing police with his nose now seemed more like an excuse than a desperate act of survival. And then came perhaps the most damning discovery. Caroline had been secretly planning to leave him. She kept a diary where she wrote about the difficulties in their relationship, about feeling trapped, and about her desire to walk away. On the very night of her murder, she had messaged a friend saying she was ready to leave with her daughter. The police began to realize that maybe the masked robbers never existed at all. The so-called break-in, the scattered belongings, the murdered dog. What if it had all been staged? And if it was, then the real killer was not some faceless intruder, but the very man who appeared to be the grieving husband. Investigators knew they had to move carefully. At this point, the case had gripped the entire nation. News outlets were reporting every detail, neighbors were terrified, and the idea of a gang of masked killers was spreading panic. If they were wrong, they risked not only losing the case but also losing the trust of the public. So instead of rushing, detectives quietly began building a timeline. They studied the security cameras in the neighborhood, interviewed residents, and examined every piece of technology in the house. Slowly, the evidence began to form a picture that was very different from the one Babies had painted. One of the first major breaks came from Caroline's phone and her diary. Investigators discovered that in the weeks leading up to her death, she had been writing down her frustrations with her marriage. She described fights, her unhappiness, and even wrote about her husband's controlling behavior. She wrote that she felt trapped, that she no longer wanted to be with him, and that she was considering leaving. These entries painted a picture of a young woman who wanted freedom, not a woman happily building a dream life with her husband. For investigators, this was a critical piece. If Caroline was planning to leave, then Babies had a very strong motive to keep her from walking away. But the real turning point was the technology. Caroline's smartwatch told investigators almost everything they needed to know. At precisely 4:05 a.m., her heart rate shot up dramatically. For the next 6 minutes, it showed signs of extreme stress, and then, at 4:11 a.m., her heart stopped completely. This meant Caroline had died much earlier than Babies had claimed. It also meant that his entire story about being tied up for hours while robbers searched the house could not be true. At the same time, Babis's own phone showed activity that made no sense for a man supposedly bound and helpless. His device had been unlocked, moved around, and even recorded steps as he walked through the house. Police now knew the impossible had happened. The grieving husband was lying. Even then, investigators played it smart. They didn't confront Babies right away. Instead, they continued to gather evidence. They looked into the so-called robbers, tracking known criminals in the area, checking their alibis, and analyzing every possible lead. At one point, suspicion even fell on a Georgian man who had tried to flee the country with a fake passport. He had a criminal history, including violent robberies, and even resembled the sketch babies had given of one of the supposed intruders. For a short while, police interrogated him, hoping they had their man. But he denied everything, and in the end, there was no evidence linking him to the murder. It became clearer than ever that the real suspect was already in front of them. Meanwhile, Babis continued to play the role of the grieving widower. He appeared on television, telling the nation how devastated he was. He said he was lucky to have known Caroline, that she was the love of his life, and that he would never recover from her loss. At Caroline's funeral, he held their baby girl in his arms, his face covered in grief, standing beside her coffin. To the public, it looked like a heartbreaking scene. To investigators, it was a performance, and a very convincing one, but the mask was beginning to slip. Forensic experts went back to the crime scene and noticed something unusual about the basement window. This was the entry point Babis insisted the intruders had used. But the truth was simple. It was far too small for 3 adult men to fit through. It was possible for a child or maybe a thin teenager to squeeze in, but not for the type of men Babis described. Why would hardened criminals choose a nearly impossible entry point when easier options were available? The explanation was obvious, because no one had entered that way at all. The scene had been staged. Investigators also discovered that the memory card removed from the security camera had been pulled out hours before the supposed break-in took place. In other words, whoever staged the robbery had done it in advance, long before Caroline was killed. Only someone inside the house could have done that. And then there was the most disturbing discovery of all: the death of the family dog. The husky had been strangled with its own leash and left hanging in the stairwell. It was not the act of intruders looking to steal money quickly and escape. It was a deliberate act, meant to make the crime scene look more brutal, more believable. By now, detectives had a clear picture. They believed Caroline and Babis had argued that night. She had threatened to leave him and take their baby daughter. In a fit of rage, Babis had smothered her, pressing a pillow over her face while she struggled to breathe. Afterward, he staged the entire scene, killing the dog, scattering belongings, tying himself up, and inventing the story of armed robbers. He wanted to buy himself time, to shift suspicion away from himself, and to appear as a victim rather than the killer. But despite his careful planning, he had overlooked the one thing he could not control: technology. Caroline's smartwatch and his own phone had betrayed him. On June 17th, just over a month after the murder, police finally made their move. They told Babis they needed him to come to Athens to discuss a breakthrough in the case. He agreed, thinking nothing was wrong. But as soon as he arrived at police headquarters, he was told the truth. They no longer believed his story. After hours of questioning, faced with the evidence, Babis broke down and confessed. He admitted that there had never been any robbers, no masked men, no violent gang. The entire story had been a lie. He told police that on the night of May 11th, he and Caroline argued. She threatened to leave him, and he could not stand the thought of losing her and their daughter. So he pinned her down, pressed a pillow against her face, and suffocated her while their baby cried in the room. Then, realizing what he had done, he set about creating an elaborate cover-up. He killed the dog, staged the robbery, tied himself up, and called police pretending to be a helpless victim. The truth was even more chilling than the lie. For over a month, Babis had lived freely, appearing in public, giving interviews, attending Caroline's funeral, and even comforting her parents, all while knowing he was the one who had killed her. He had fooled almost everyone, even convincing an entire nation that ruthless criminals were on the loose. And all the while, he held his daughter in his arms, playing the part of the grieving husband. When the truth came out, Greece was stunned. The story that had once seemed like a tragedy caused by faceless robbers was in fact something far darker. A calculated murder committed by the man who was supposed to love and protect Caroline. When news of Babis's confession broke, the entire country was in shock. For weeks, Greece had lived in fear of a ruthless gang of intruders. Families had changed their routines, doors were double-locked, and rumors spread about criminals who struck without warning. Now people realized it was all a lie. There were no masked men, no brutal gang, no violent robbers hunting innocent families. The monster had been inside the home all along. The man who had appeared on television crying for justice. The man who had begged for help at the funeral. The man who had held his infant daughter in his arms and claimed he had lost the love of his life. He had been the killer. Caroline's parents were devastated. They had trusted Babis, welcomed him into their family, and believed he loved their daughter. To discover that he was the one who had taken her life was almost unbearable. They not only lost their daughter, but also had to come to terms with the fact that her husband had betrayed them in the cruelest way possible. Their only comfort was their granddaughter, the child who had been at the center of it all, the innocent baby who had witnessed her mother's final moments. Public outrage was immediate and intense. People could not believe how far Babis had gone to cover his tracks. He had staged an entire crime scene, strangled the family dog, and tied himself up, all in an attempt to fool investigators. He had even risked blaming innocent people, pointing police toward organized gangs and criminals, and perhaps most disturbing of all, he had fooled almost everyone. For over a month, he walked free, enjoying sympathy and support while his wife lay in her grave. The media called it the murder that fooled the world, and the name stuck. As the case moved to trial, more disturbing details emerged. Investigators revealed Caroline's diary entries showing her increasing unhappiness in the relationship. She had written about how controlling Babis had become, how she felt trapped, and how she was considering leaving him. In one heartbreaking entry, she wrote that she loved him too much to leave, even though the relationship hurt her. In another, she confessed that she wanted to go but stayed because of their baby. These entries painted a clear picture of a young woman who felt powerless and isolated, caught between her love for her child and her desire to escape a suffocating marriage. During the trial, prosecutors argued that this was not a crime of passion, not a sudden outburst of anger, but a cold and calculated act. They said Babis had complete control of the situation. He had strangled Caroline for minutes, not seconds. He had then carefully staged the crime scene, killed the dog, scattered belongings, and tied himself up to appear as a victim. He had shown no mercy, no hesitation, and no concern for his infant daughter, who was left crying beside her mother's lifeless body. To the court, it was clear this was premeditated murder. The defense tried to soften the picture, claiming Babis acted out of desperation, that he lost control during an argument, that he was afraid of losing his daughter. But the evidence was overwhelming. The smartwatch data, the phone records, the diary, the staged crime scene, all of it pointed to a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And the nation had already made up its mind. To them, he was a liar, a manipulator, and a murderer. In May 2022, Babis was found guilty of premeditated murder, animal cruelty, and attempting to mislead investigators. The sentence was severe, life in prison. As the judge read the verdict, there was little sign of remorse from the man who had once fooled so many. Caroline's family sat in the courtroom, heartbroken but relieved that justice had finally been served. For them, it was not enough to heal the wound, but at least the truth was no longer hidden. Even after the verdict, the case continued to haunt people. It raised difficult questions about appearances, trust, and hidden abuse. To outsiders, Babis and Caroline seemed like the perfect couple, young, attractive, successful, building a dream life together. On social media, their photos showed happiness, vacations, and love. But behind closed doors, the truth was very different. Caroline was trapped in a controlling relationship, one that ended with her death. It was a reminder that what we see on the outside is not always what is real, that behind smiles and photographs, there can be secrets, manipulation, and fear. Caroline's daughter, too young to remember her mother, became the focus of attention. She would grow up without either parent, her mother murdered, her father in prison. Caroline's parents fought for custody, determined to raise their granddaughter in a safe and loving environment, far away from the shadow of the man who had taken their daughter's life. They promised to make sure the child would know the truth one day, that her mother had been strong, kind, and loving, and that her life had been stolen in an act of cruelty. For the people of Greece, the case left a scar. It was not just the brutality of the murder, but the deception that followed. For over a month, everyone had believed the lie. They had cried for Caroline, pitied Babis, and feared the criminals he invented. They had been manipulated by his performance, his tears, his carefully crafted story. And when the truth came out, it was as if the entire country had been betrayed. Even years later, people still talk about the case. It is studied in criminology classes, analyzed by psychologists, and discussed by journalists. How could a man so calmly deceive everyone around him? How could he play the grieving husband while knowing the truth? How could he stage a crime scene with such detail, all while his baby cried in the next room? These questions linger, leaving people unsettled. In the end, the story of Caroline Crouch is not just about a murder. It is about trust, manipulation, and betrayal. It is about how appearances can fool even the closest friends and family. And it is about the silent struggles of a young woman who felt trapped in a relationship she could not escape. Her diary entries, her final words on paper, remain as a haunting reminder of the pain she lived through. She wrote that she loved him too much to leave, even though it hurt her. And that love, tragically, was what cost her life. The case will always be remembered as the murder that fooled the world. A story that began like a fairy tale, a young girl falling in love with a charming pilot, eloping to build a dream life together, ended in the darkest way imaginable. And the world, for a time, believed the fantasy. But in the end, the truth came out, as it always does.